My mother texted me that I was not invited to the luxury Mediterranean cruise I had fully funded for our family right after I bought them a house worth nearly $1 million. So I sold the house while they were sailing across the ocean. You will not believe what happened when they returned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Lydia and I am 34 years old. I stood at the Delta check-in counter at the international terminal feeling a rare sense of genuine excitement. My luxury boutique staging firm had just concluded its most profitable quarter yet, and I was ready to celebrate. The terminal around me buzzed with the frantic energy of travelers dragging oversized luggage and checking departure boards. I held my passport tightly in my hand. I had spent $30,000 booking a 2-week Mediterranean cruise for my family. It was supposed to be a bonding experience, a chance for all of us to reconnect after a highly stressful year. I had booked premium staterooms for my parents, Patricia and Richard, and a suite for my older brother Cameron and his wife Courtney. I even arranged for private excursions in Greece and Italy, hoping to create memories we could cherish for a lifetime. I was next in line to check my bags when my phone chimed with a text message notification. I pulled it from my pocket, expecting a message from my mother asking where we should meet near the gate. Instead, the text from Patricia read, "You are not coming. Dad wants just family. We gave your ticket to Courtney's sister." I stared at the glowing screen, trying to process the words. My brain simply refused to compute the sheer cruelty of the message. Just family. I was her daughter. I was the one who had carefully planned the entire itinerary over the past 6 months. I was the one who had paid for every single aspect of this luxury vacation. How could I suddenly not be family? The absolute audacity of giving my premium ticket to my sister-in-law's sister was staggering. A woman I had met exactly twice was currently preparing to board a ship on my dime while I stood abandoned at the airport. I stepped out of the check-in line, ignoring the annoyed sighs of the passengers behind me, and immediately dialed my mother's number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. But it was not my mother. It was my 37-year-old brother Cameron. He laughed loudly into the receiver over the background noise of the busy airport lounge. "Well, if it is not the workaholic spinster," Cameron said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "What do you want, Lydia? We are about to board the plane." I demanded to know what was going on and why my mother had sent that horrific text message. Cameron sighed loudly into the phone as if I was being an unbearable nuisance. "Look, Lydia, you need to stop acting so entitled right now. Courtney's sister really needed a vacation. She has been going through a hard time, and frankly, she is much more fun to be around than you. You always bring the mood down with your constant business talk and serious attitude." Cameron. "I paid $30,000 for this trip," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. "You cannot just give away a ticket that I purchased with my own hard-earned money to a stranger." Cameron scoffed loudly. "Your hard-earned money? Please, you just decorate houses for rich people. It is not like you have a real job that contributes anything meaningful to society. I am launching a massive cryptocurrency firm next month, and I need this trip to decompress before the big launch. You know how stressful the startup world is. You should be supporting my mental health instead of throwing a massive tantrum at the check-in counter." I could barely comprehend his deep delusion. Cameron was a perpetual failure who constantly called himself an entrepreneur but had never actually built a successful company in his entire life. Every single venture he touched went bankrupt within a year. And now he was lecturing me about hard work while standing in a VIP lounge that I had paid for. Before I could respond to his absurd claims, I heard scuffling on the other end of the line. My mother Patricia snatched the phone from him. Her tone was sharp and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "Lydia, you need to calm down and stop making a scene," Patricia snapped. "You have plenty of money. You can go to Europe anytime you want. Your brother desperately needs this relaxation. He has been under so much extreme pressure lately trying to build his legacy." "Mom, you told me I was not family," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You took my ticket and gave it to a complete stranger." "Do not twist my words," Patricia replied smoothly, instantly deploying her favorite gaslighting tactic. Your father and I just wanted a peaceful family vacation without you constantly reminding us how much everything costs. You are always so terribly selfish, always trying to ruin your brother's happiness. Selfish. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. I paid for the cruise. I just bought you and Dad a $966,000 house in a beautiful coastal Florida community because you were secretly drowning in massive debt and facing immediate bankruptcy. I completely saved you from losing everything. Patricia scoffed, completely unbothered by the stark reality of my massive financial support. We let you buy us that house, Lydia. It was the very least you could do after everything we sacrificed to raise you. You owe us this piece. We are keeping the ticket. Do not call us again until we get back from our trip. The line went completely dead. I lowered the phone slowly. I stood in the middle of the bustling terminal holding my luggage handle. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg them to let me come. The lifetime of constantly trying to buy their love, of hoping that my financial support would finally earn me a secure place in their hearts, vanished in a single instant. A cold and absolute clarity washed over me. I realized then that they would never ever see me as a daughter. I was just a convenient ATM to them, a bottomless source of funding for their beloved golden child, Cameron. As I watched the families around me hugging and laughing, the stark contrast between their joy and my isolation became agonizingly clear. I had spent weeks picking out the perfect shore excursions, researching the best local restaurants in Florence, and carefully coordinating our travel schedules. I had even purchased matching luggage tags, a silly gesture that now felt deeply humiliating. All that effort, all that meticulous planning meant absolutely nothing to them. They had effortlessly discarded me the moment they secured the financial benefits of the trip. The realization settled heavy in my chest, replacing the initial shock with a burning, righteous indignation. I was not just a neglected daughter. I was a fully functioning adult who had allowed herself to be financially exploited under the guise of family loyalty. That realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also the exact medicine I needed to finally wake up. I turned my luggage cart around and walked away from the Delta counter. I found a quiet table at a terminal cafe overlooking the busy tarmac. I ordered a black coffee, sat down, and opened my laptop. No worries. I texted back to the family group chat. Have a great trip. Then I securely logged into the cruise line portal. My corporate credit card was linked to every single stateroom on their reservation. They were expecting to enjoy 2 entire weeks of unlimited luxury on my dime. With a few simple clicks, I completely revoked the payment authorization for Patricia, Richard, Cameron, and Courtney. I canceled the premium unlimited drink packages. I canceled the private guided tours in Rome. I canceled the beautiful sunset catamaran excursion in Santorini. I canceled the expensive luxury spa credits Courtney had booked for herself and her sister. I removed my credit card from their onboard accounts entirely. Once they boarded that massive ship, they would have absolutely $0 attached to their room keys. They would have to individually pay for every bottle of water, every meal outside the main dining hall, and every single excursion out of their own empty pockets. A deeply satisfying smile spread across my face as I closed the cruise portal. Let us see how they enjoy Europe with $0, I thought to myself. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, feeling significantly lighter than I had in many years. The toxic cord tying me to their endless entitlement had finally been severed. But my moment of peaceful clarity was abruptly interrupted. My phone vibrated heavily on the cafe table. It was an urgent push notification from my premium property management application. I opened the app and stared at the alert in utter confusion. The smart locks on the $966,000 coastal Florida house I had just purchased for my parents had been manually overridden. Someone had explicitly entered the master security code and permanently changed the locks. My blood ran completely cold. My parents were supposed to be boarding a flight to Europe right now. They could not possibly be at the coastal property. I tapped the screen to immediately view the security camera feed from the driveway. The live video loaded and my jaw clenched tight. A massive commercial moving truck was backed perfectly into the driveway of the pristine coastal estate. I could see two strange men carrying a large leather sofa through the front doors. The audacity of this new betrayal ignited a blazing fire inside me. I slammed my laptop shut and grabbed my bags. I was no longer going to play the role of the victim. It was time for absolute justice. The drive from the airport took less than 40 minutes, but my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. The bright Florida sun beat down heavily on the windshield as I pulled through the security gates of the exclusive 55-plus coastal community. The neighborhood was exceptionally quiet this time of day, mostly filled with retirees driving golf carts and tending to their pristine flower beds. I turned onto the palm-lined cul-de-sac, fully expecting to find an empty driveway. Instead, a massive commercial moving truck blocked the entire entrance. Its heavy diesel engine idled loudly, disrupting the peaceful silence of the street. A crew of sweaty men in matching gray uniforms hauled heavy cardboard boxes and unwieldy furniture up the expensive paver walkway. I slammed my car into park right behind the massive truck and marched straight toward the custom glass front doors. The smart lock panel on the front door was entirely dark. The protective cover had been forcibly popped off, and the internal wiring manually reset. The property damage made my pulse pound. I had personally paid a premium to have that high-end security system installed just to ensure my parents felt safe and comfortable in their new retirement home. To see it destroyed so casually was a physical blow that momentarily stunned me. I took a deep breath, pushed the heavy doors open, and stepped inside. I walked through the open double doors and immediately stopped in my tracks. Courtney stood squarely in the middle of the grand foyer, holding a clipboard in one hand and a venti iced coffee in the other. My older brother Cameron had married her 5 years ago, and she possessed the exact same brand of unearned arrogance and deep delusion that he did. She pointed a manicured finger toward the master suite, barking orders at the crew like a dictator. "Be careful with that leather sectional," she yelled at two exhausted movers struggling under the weight of a massive, ugly brown couch. "It goes right against the far wall by the bay windows. Do not scuff the hardwood floors." "Courtney," I said, my voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings of the foyer. "What exactly is going on here?" Courtney spun around. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her face twisted into a smug, self-satisfied grin. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced coffee, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "Well, if it is not the angry sister," she said, clicking her pen against the clipboard. "I thought you were supposed to be crying in an airport terminal right now. Cameron said you threw a massive fit at the check-in counter when you found out my sister got your ticket." "I asked you a direct question, Courtney," I said, taking a slow, calculated step closer to her. "Why is there a commercial moving truck parked in the driveway of my property, and why are movers currently carrying Cameron's atrocious furniture into the master bedroom?" Courtney laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed loudly off the walls. "Your property? That is hilarious, Lydia. Really funny." She casually flipped to the second page on her clipboard and ripped off a crumpled piece of paper. She held it out to me like she was handing a parking ticket to a stranger. "Patricia did not text you before their flight took off. She and Richard signed the deed over to Cameron yesterday morning before they left for Europe. It is our house now. Mom said you can come by next week to pick up your staging furniture. We do not need your cold minimalist aesthetic in our new family home. We are bringing in our own interior decorator tomorrow." I took the crumpled paper from her hand. It was a standard fill in the blank legal template clearly printed from a free online website. At the very top, someone had hastily scribbled "quitclaim deed" in bright blue ink. Below that, my mother and father had signed their names, supposedly transferring full ownership of the luxury property to my brother Cameron. There was no official notary stamp anywhere on the page. There was no raised county seal. There was nothing connecting this garbage paper to any legitimate real estate transaction. My parents had actually believed they could simply gift a nearly $1 million house to my brother just because they felt completely entitled to the wealth I had built from the ground up. They assumed that because I handed them the keys to save them from their mounting credit card debt, They owned the very ground the property stood on. They viewed my money as family money, and my assets as theirs to distribute to the golden child. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure they did not end up homeless, and this was how they repaid my generosity. I stared at the fake deed, fighting the sudden urge to burst out laughing at the sheer stupidity of their plan. "Courtney," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. "Patricia and Richard do not own this house." Courtney rolled her eyes heavily, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh, stop being so bitter, Lydia. Mom and Dad bought this place for their retirement. They just decided that Cameron needed it more than they did, since he is actually trying to build a lasting legacy for this family. You have plenty of money. You do not need to be so greedy and selfish all the time." I took a deep breath, letting the absolute absurdity of her statement wash over me. "I bought this house, Courtney," I explained slowly and clearly, as if speaking to a small child. "I paid $966,000 in pure cash for this property, exactly 89 days ago. I did not put it in Patricia or Richard's name. I purchased this coastal estate under a blind limited liability company strictly for tax purposes. My name is the only name on the corporate operating agreement. The property taxes, the utility bills, and the homeowners association fees are all paid directly from my business accounts." Courtney's smug smile faltered just a fraction. "You are lying. Mom showed us the paperwork. They signed the contract right in front of us." "They signed a standard residential lease agreement," I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave. "I allowed them to live here rent-free because the bank was about to foreclose on their condo in Connecticut. They are tenants, Courtney, nothing more. You cannot sign over a deed to a property you merely rent. This piece of paper you just handed me is legally worthless." Courtney's face flushed a deep, angry red. She stepped forward, aggressively invading my personal space. "You are just jealous," she spat venomously. "You have always been terribly jealous that Cameron is the favorite child. You cannot stand that he is finally going to be more successful than you. You think you can just control everyone with your money, but Cameron is 10 steps ahead of you." I looked at her, genuinely curious about the depths of their shared delusion. 10 steps ahead. By attempting to steal a house he does not own. Courtney sneered, leaning in close. "By securing our financial future, no thanks to you. Cameron is already taking out a $500,000 home equity line of credit against this property while he is on the cruise. He signed the electronic bank documents this morning, using the deed transfer Mom gave us. He is finally launching his new cryptocurrency firm. We are going to be wealthy, and you are going to be stuck staging houses for other people." The air in the grand foyer suddenly felt completely still. My eyes locked onto Courtney's face. I processed her arrogant words with a cold, terrifying clarity. My brother was notoriously bad with money, but I never expected him to cross the line into outright criminality. "Cameron applied for a $500,000 loan against this property," I asked, my tone dangerously quietly. "Yes," Courtney bragged, lifting her chin triumphantly. "The funds clear on Monday morning, so you can take your fake LLC story and shove it, Lydia. The bank accepted the deed transfer. We own this house now. I want you off my property before I call the police for trespassing." She turned her back on me and walked toward the master suite, yelling at the movers to be careful with a cheap floor lamp. She had absolutely no idea what she had just confessed to doing. Cameron had not just acted entitled. He had taken a forged document signed by simple residential tenants and deliberately submitted it to a federal banking institution to extract $500,000 in equity from a corporate asset he did not own. He was using electronic banking systems to process the transaction. My brother was not just a failing entrepreneur anymore. He was actively committing federal wire fraud and bank fraud against my corporation, while floating somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, drinking cocktails on my canceled credit card. He was facing decades in federal prison because he felt entitled to steal my hard-earned success. I did not scream at Courtney. I did not demand that she throw the movers out right then and there. I simply pulled my cell phone from my pocket and walked straight out the front door into the warm afternoon air. The warm Florida heat wrapped around my shoulders, but my mind was completely ice cold. I had tried to protect my family for years, but they had chosen their path. I stood on the manicured front lawn listening to the loud crash of furniture being moved inside my home. The sound no longer bothered me. It was simply the noise of a trap snapping shut on their greed. I dialed the direct number for Silas, my corporate real estate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Silas," I said, staring at the massive moving truck idling in my driveway. "Call the commercial real estate broker immediately. It is now time to sell the coastal property today. Put the listing up within the hour and tell them we are only accepting pure cash offers for an immediate close." They wanted to play games with my property, but they are about to learn that the house always wins. I walked right back through the heavy custom glass doors of the house, letting them swing shut behind me with a solid thud. The two movers were halfway across the expansive grand foyer, sweating profusely under the immense weight of Cameron's ugly brown leather sectional. The couch was an absolute monstrosity, complete with built-in plastic cup holders and cheap reclining mechanisms that clanked loudly with every step they took. It looked utterly ridiculous against the pristine white marble flooring and the elegant coastal aesthetic I had meticulously designed. I raised my voice so it carried clearly and sharply over the echoing space. "Put the furniture down right now!" I instructed the men, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "If you take one more step into this house, you will be actively participating in a felony home invasion. I am the sole legal owner of this property, and I am officially ordering you to stop." The two men froze instantly. They looked from me to Courtney, completely unsure of who held actual authority in this bizarre situation. The taller mover, a burly guy with a worn baseball cap, carefully lowered his end of the heavy couch to the floor. He wiped his dripping brow with the back of his hand and muttered that his crew did not want any legal trouble. He signaled to his partner, and they both stepped away from the sectional, retreating toward the open front doors. Courtney let out a shrill, piercing shriek of pure indignation. She marched up to the tall mover and demanded he pick the sofa back up immediately. She screamed that she was paying them by the hour and that they needed to follow her strict orders. When the man refused, shaking his head and backing further down the driveway, Courtney completely lost whatever little composure she had left. Her face contorted into a mask of pure fury. She dug frantically into her oversized designer purse, pulled out her smartphone, and jabbed her perfectly manicured fingers against the glass screen. She dialed 911 right in front of me, keeping her hostile gaze locked onto my face. She put the phone to her ear, and the exact second the emergency dispatcher answered, her voice miraculously morphed into a high-pitched tremble of manufactured terror. She launched into a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. She told the operator that her unhinged and deeply jealous sister-in-law had just broken into her brand-new coastal property. She claimed I was violently trespassing, screaming at the top of my lungs, and physically threatening the moving crew. She faked a terrified sob, begging the dispatcher to send police officers immediately because she felt incredibly unsafe and feared for her life in her very own home. After she hung up the phone, Courtney crossed her arms tightly over her chest and glared at me with absolute triumph. She thought she had won the ultimate victory. She truly believed that the local police arriving would somehow validate her entirely fabricated reality and force me out of the house. We had about 10 or 15 minutes to wait before the local authorities would show up, and Courtney used every single second of that time to parrot my mother Patricia's deeply toxic rhetoric. She paced back and forth across the grand foyer, her expensive sandals clicking sharply against the marble. She launched into a vicious, unyielding tirade meant to break my spirit and force me into submission. "You are so intensely bitter, Lydia," she spat out, gesturing wildly with her hands. "You are just furious because Cameron is the one actually carrying on the family legacy. Mom warned us you would do something exactly like this. She said you would try to ruin his big moment just because you are miserable and alone in your sad little corporate life." Courtney stepped closer, jabbing her finger aggressively in my direction. "You have always been jealous of us. Look at what you tried to do at our wedding. You tried to completely ruin the happiest day of our lives by refusing to pay for the open bar. Mom and Dad had to take out another massive personal loan just to cover your incredibly selfish behavior. You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank, and you could not even buy your only brother decent drinks for his wedding guests. Now you are trying to steal the beautiful house Mom explicitly gave him. You are sick, Lydia. You need serious psychiatric help. I stood there listening to her, completely unbothered by her venomous accusations. 4 years ago, when they got married, Cameron and Courtney had demanded I write a check for $40,000 to cover their extravagant reception. When I politely declined, offering instead to pay for their honeymoon flights to Hawaii, my family had labeled me a greedy, heartless monster. My parents had indeed taken out a terrible high-interest personal loan to fund Courtney's top-tier open bar and ridiculous ice sculptures. That same reckless financial behavior was exactly why they had faced total bankruptcy last year, forcing me to step in and buy this house to save them from financial ruin. The sheer irony of Courtney standing in the foyer of the house I bought, claiming I was the one destroying the family legacy, was almost poetic in its absurdity. I did not argue with her. Arguing with Courtney was like trying to reason with a brick wall. It was a complete waste of breath and energy. I simply walked past her, ignoring her continuing shrieks, and headed over to the kitchen island. I pulled out one of the tall, sleek bar stools and sat down calmly. I took my phone out of my pocket and opened my secure messaging application. I had already set the cash sale of the house in motion with my commercial broker, but I needed my corporate real estate attorney, Donovan, to handle the immediate local trespassing issue happening right in front of me. I quickly texted Donovan requesting the immediate electronic delivery of the complete legal file for the coastal property. I typed out a concise message explaining that my brother was attempting to commit mortgage fraud using a forged quitclaim deed and that the police were currently en route to the house. I asked Donovan to send the official state-registered articles of incorporation for the Blind Limited Liability Company and the original signed residential lease agreement. Purchasing this estate under a blind LLC had been the smartest business decision I had ever made. I originally did it for strict tax purposes and to shield my personal assets from any potential liability. Because it was a blind trust, my parents never saw my personal name on any of the closing documents. They only interacted with the property management firm I had hired to act as the intermediary. My parents never owned a single brick, a single window, or a single blade of grass on this property. They had merely signed a standard residential lease agreement, which allowed them to live here rent-free. In their boundless arrogance and entitlement, they had simply assumed the dense legal paperwork they signed was a deed transferring ownership to them because they felt entirely entitled to my wealth. Donovan was incredibly efficient. Within 3 minutes, my phone chimed with a secure email notification. I opened the encrypted files and downloaded the watermarked PDFs directly to my device. I had the state-certified articles of incorporation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole managing member and exclusive owner of the LLC that held the title to the house. I had the certified bank records showing the massive wire transfer for the cash purchase of the property. And most importantly, I had the heavily detailed 50-page lease agreement explicitly signed by both Patricia and Richard, acknowledging they were simply renting the property under my strict corporate terms. The lease strictly forbade them from subletting, assigning the lease, or transferring residency to anyone else. My legal arsenal was fully loaded, organized, and ready to be deployed. I sat quietly at the kitchen counter, casually scrolling through the digital documents, while Courtney continued her unhinged rant in the background. She was loudly boasting to the movers, who were still awkwardly standing in the driveway, about the luxury vehicles they were going to lease once Cameron's home equity line of credit officially cleared the bank. She talked about hiring a celebrity interior designer to completely gut the master bathroom because the expensive imported Italian marble I had chosen was apparently too depressing for her vibrant personality. I let her talk. I let her dig the hole as deep as possible. Every word out of her mouth only confirmed the absolute delusion my family operated under. The distinct wail of police sirens finally cut through the quiet peace of the suburban neighborhood. The sound grew louder and louder, bouncing off the manicured houses until it abruptly stopped right outside the front doors. I looked through the large front bay windows and saw two local police cruisers pull up hard against the curb, deliberately blocking the commercial moving truck from leaving. Red and blue lights flashed brightly, reflecting off the pristine glass of the front entrance and drawing the attention of several curious neighbors who began peeking out of their front doors. Courtney let out a loud, dramatic gasp the moment she saw the flashing lights. She instantly snapped back into her fragile victim persona. She forced real tears to well up in her eyes, her face crumpling into an expression of profound distress and terror. She snatched the forged, unnotarized piece of paper off the kitchen counter and clutched it tightly to her chest like a protective shield. She sprinted toward the front doors, throwing them wide open and running straight toward the approaching officers. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger back at the house, crocodile tears streaming rapidly down her face. She sobbed hysterically, waving the completely fake deed wildly in the air and screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that the officers place me in handcuffs immediately and drag me off her property. The two local police cruisers skidded to a halt at the edge of the driveway, their tires biting harshly into the pavement. Flashing red and blue lights washed over the pristine landscaping, instantly shattering the quiet tranquility of the upscale retirement community. Doors opened, and heavy boots hit the ground as two uniformed officers approached the house. Courtney did not waste a single second. She practically launched herself off the front porch and sprinted toward the lead officer. She forced a frantic, hysterical sob from her throat, perfectly playing the role of the terrified, victimized homeowner. She thrust the crumpled, unnotarized piece of paper directly into the lead officer's chest. Tears streamed rapidly down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger back at me as I stood calmly on the front steps. She screamed to the officers that her deeply unhinged, violently jealous sister-in-law had just broken into her brand-new coastal property. She claimed I was trespassing, verbally assaulting her and physically threatening the moving crew who were just trying to do their jobs. She demanded that they place me in handcuffs immediately and drag me off her lawn. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern, weather-beaten face, held up a firm hand to stop her frantic screaming. He took the crumpled piece of paper from her shaking hands and stepped back to examine it. He pulled a penlight from his tactical vest and shined it over the document. He flipped the paper over once, then twice, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He was actively looking for a raised county seal, a legitimate notary stamp, or any official municipal tracking number. He found absolutely nothing. It was just a standard template printed from a free legal website, completely devoid of any binding authority. The officer looked back at Courtney, his expression rapidly shifting from professional concern to intense, hardened skepticism. I walked slowly down the front steps, my posture straight and my expression completely neutral. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not shed a single tear. I held my digital tablet out to the second officer who had stepped up to flank his partner. I introduced myself clearly and concisely, stating my full legal name. I informed the officers that I was the sole legal owner of the property and that the woman crying hysterically on the driveway was currently attempting to illegally occupy a corporate asset using a forged document. I tapped the screen of my tablet, opening the encrypted legal file my corporate attorney Donovan had just delivered. I handed the tablet to the lead officer. I presented the official state-certified articles of incorporation for the Blind Limited Liability Company. The digital documents featured secure watermarks and official government timestamps. They proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the managing member and exclusive owner of the LLC that held the full title to the coastal estate. I then pulled up the original residential lease agreement. I explained to the officers that Patricia and Richard Wilson were merely residential tenants. I showed them the specific clauses in the 50-page document that my parents had explicitly signed. The lease strictly prohibited subletting, assigning the lease to a third party, or transferring residency to anyone else. My parents had blatantly broken their lease by attempting an illegal sublet to my brother. The lead officer cross-referenced the signatures on my certified digital lease with the signatures on Courtney's crumpled piece of paper. The reality of the situation dawned on him instantly. The lead officer handed Courtney her piece of paper back. He looked her dead in the eye and informed her in a very flat, authoritative tone that her document was entirely fraudulent. He explained that residential tenants have absolutely zero legal right to deed a property to another person. Courtney stopped crying the exact second the officer spoke. Her manufactured tears instantly dried up, replaced by a deep, furious shade of purple that crept up her neck and settled into her cheeks. She stomped her foot on the driveway, pointing aggressively at my tablet. She shrieked that my documents were fake. She screamed that her mother-in-law had explicitly promised them this house because her husband was the only child actually carrying on the family legacy. The officers ignored her tantrum completely. The second officer turned his attention to the two movers who were standing frozen near the back of their commercial truck. The officer pointed a stern finger at the moving crew. He ordered them to pack everything back into their vehicle immediately. He explicitly warned them that if they carried one more piece of furniture across the threshold of the house, they would be placed in handcuffs and formally charged with aiding and abetting a residential burglary. The movers did not need to be told twice. Wanting absolutely no part of a federal property dispute, they practically sprinted into the grand foyer. They grabbed Cameron's massive, ugly brown leather sectional and hauled it back out to the truck at top speed, leaving scuff marks on the driveway in their haste to retreat. The lead officer turned his attention back to Courtney. He pointed his finger straight down the palm-lined street. He told her she had exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises entirely. He made it crystal clear that if she was still standing on my property, when those 10 minutes expired, she would be arrested for criminal trespassing and attempting to secure a property with fraudulent documentation. Courtney's entitled, smug demeanor shattered into a million pieces. Panic finally set in as she realized the police were not going to enforce her delusion. Her hands shook violently as she dug into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She dialed Cameron's number, frantically pacing in tight circles on the driveway. Cameron answered from the luxury cruise ship, the sounds of clinking glasses and tropical music echoing loudly through the phone's speaker. Courtney practically shrieked into the receiver. She told Cameron that the police were currently kicking her off the property. She cried that the deed Patricia had given them was completely fake, and that I had showed up with actual corporate documents proving I owned the entire estate. Cameron erupted into a blind, vicious rage. The sound of his furious voice projected clearly from the speakerphone, carrying across the quiet suburban street. He demanded that Courtney put the police officer on the phone right that second. Courtney eagerly thrust her phone toward the lead officer, who reluctantly leaned in to listen, his arms crossed tightly over his tactical vest. Cameron began screaming at the officer, his voice dripping with intense arrogance and absolute entitlement. He threatened to sue the entire police department for harassing his wife. He yelled that he was a highly successful cryptocurrency entrepreneur and that the house rightfully belonged to him because his mother said so. He loudly boasted that he was already in the middle of processing a $500,000 home equity line of credit against the property, inadvertently confessing to federal bank fraud right into the ear of a sworn law enforcement officer. Cameron then turned his wrath toward me. He screamed through the phone speaker that I was a lying snake. He yelled that I was just a bitter, jealous spinster trying to steal his rightful inheritance and ruin his massive business launch. He demanded the officers arrest me immediately and hand the house keys over to his wife. The lead officer listened to Cameron's unhinged rant for exactly 15 seconds. Then, with a look of profound disgust, the officer reached out and tapped the red button on Courtney's screen, hanging up on my brother mid-sentence. The sudden silence on the driveway was deafening. The officer handed the phone back to Courtney. He tapped his wristwatch and stared her down. He informed her that she now had exactly 7 minutes left to leave the property before she left in the back of a squad car. Courtney let out a primal scream of pure, unadulterated frustration. She stomped her feet on the driveway like a petulant toddler, hurling a vicious stream of profanities in my direction. When neither I nor the police officers reacted to her outburst, she finally spun around and stormed toward her luxury SUV. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and aggressively keyed the ignition. She sped out of the quiet cul-de-sac, her tires screeching loudly against the pavement as she fled the neighborhood. The movers finished loading the last of the boxes moments later. They secured the back of their commercial truck, offered a quick apologetic wave to the police, and drove away. The property was finally perfectly silent once more. The officers approached me on the front steps, handing back my tablet. They thanked me for my calm cooperation and strongly advised me to contact a locksmith to repair the damaged front door panel. They returned to their cruisers and drove off, leaving me standing alone on the pristine driveway of my reclaimed coastal estate. I walked back into the house and manually locked the heavy glass doors behind me. The grand foyer was empty, but the chaotic intrusion left me feeling unsettled. I needed to thoroughly inspect the property to ensure Courtney and the clumsy movers had not damaged anything during their brief illegal occupation. I walked straight down the hallway and entered the master suite, the exact room where they had been trying to shove Cameron's massive sectional. The room was completely empty, bathed in warm afternoon sunlight filtering through the large bay windows. I paced slowly across the expensive space, keeping my eyes locked on the floorboards. I was actively searching for deep scratches or dents in the custom-imported hardwood. As I stepped near the entrance of the large walk-in closet, my foot suddenly caught on an uneven surface. I stumbled forward, my arms flailing as I barely managed to catch my balance against the heavy wooden doorframe. I looked down at the floor in confusion. One of the polished hardwood planks was visibly loose, its edge slightly elevated above the surrounding boards. I knelt down on the floor and wedged my fingers under the edge of the wood. I pulled upward and the plank lifted away with surprising ease, revealing a dark, intentionally hollowed-out space between the heavy floor joists. I stared into the dark cavity, my pulse quickening. Nestled deep inside the hidden compartment was a heavy metal lockbox. It was a rugged, fireproof security safe, completely covered in a fine layer of dust. It featured a complex mechanical combination dial on the front panel. Attached to the lid was a small, tarnished brass plaque securely riveted to the metal. Engraved deeply into the brass were my father's initials, Richard Wilson. I knelt on the bare hardwood floor and pulled the heavy metal lockbox out from the dark cavity between the joists. The thick layer of dust coated my fingers, but I did not care. I ran my thumb over the tarnished brass plaque reading Richard Wilson. My father had always been fiercely protective of his private financial documents. He frequently lectured me about the importance of securing sensitive paperwork, claiming it was a crucial habit for any successful business owner. Seeing his personal safe hidden under the floorboards of the house I bought for him was jarring but not entirely surprising. I sat cross-legged and pulled the heavy box into my lap. The mechanical dial stared back at me, demanding a 4-digit code. My father was a creature of absolute habit. He was deeply predictable in every aspect of his life. I turned the cold metal dial to the numbers of his wedding anniversary. I pressed the latch, but the box remained firmly locked. I tried the year he started his first manufacturing job. Nothing happened. A quiet, bitter realization settled over me. I spun the dial again, entering the 4 digits that dictated the entire dynamic of our family. 0812, August 12th, Cameron's birthday. The heavy internal mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet room. The thick lid popped open. The sheer predictability of his favoritism was almost laughable. Even in his deepest secrets, my father prioritized his golden child above all else. I pushed the heavy lid all the way back, expecting to find a stash of emergency cash or perhaps my grandmother's missing vintage jewelry. My parents had always claimed those heirlooms were lost during a move, but I had long suspected they pawned them to fund one of Cameron's early ventures. Instead of valuables, the safe was packed to the brim with thick manila folders. The paper smelled stale and old, like the damp basement of our childhood home. I pulled out the first folder. It was labeled Personal Taxes in my father's tight, aggressive handwriting. I flipped it open, expecting to see their joint returns. Instead, my own name jumped off the page. Lydia Wilson. I frowned, pulling the thick stack of papers into the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay windows. These were not simple tax returns. They were comprehensive financial portfolios. I dug deeper into the box, pulling out original bank statements, credit reports, and loan origination documents. The papers were pristine, perfectly preserved in clear plastic sleeves. I opened a thick packet from a major national commercial bank, dated exactly 12 years ago. My eyes scanned the top page, and my heart completely stopped beating. It was a master promissory note for a massive unsecured personal line of credit. The total approved amount was $150,000. The primary borrower listed on the first page was Lydia Wilson. Printed right below my name was my exact social security number, my childhood home address, and a forged signature that vaguely resembled my own handwriting. My hands began to shake violently as I flipped through the rest of the documents. The line of credit had been fully maxed out within exactly 3 weeks of being opened. I stared at the bank transfer receipts, tracking the money as it flowed out of the fraudulent account. The funds were not used for home repairs or medical emergencies. Every single dollar had been systematically wired to a corporate bank account registered to Genesis Tech Holdings. I remembered Genesis Tech Holdings vividly. It was Cameron's very first attempt at becoming a technology mogul. He was 25 years old at the time, convinced he was the next great Silicon Valley visionary. He had rented expensive premium office space, bought luxury corporate vehicles, and completely bankrupted the company within 8 months. My parents had sworn they never gave him a single dime for that ridiculous venture, claiming Cameron had successfully secured private angel investors. The truth was staring me right in the face. My parents were the angel investors, and they had used my stolen identity to fund his entire delusion. A wave of profound, agonizing memory washed over me. I was 22 years old when this loan was taken out. I had just graduated from college, working 80-hour weeks as a junior design assistant, trying to build my staging business from the ground up. I had saved every penny I earned to rent my very first luxury apartment in downtown Boston. I remembered sitting in the leasing office feeling so incredibly proud of myself. The leasing agent had taken my application, run my background check, and then returned to the lobby with a look of deep pity. She handed my application back and told me I was instantly denied. She said my credit score was completely destroyed. She told me I had massive defaulted loans and collections accounts severely damaging my financial profile. I was completely humiliated. I cried the entire train ride back to my parents' house. When I walked through the front door and told them my credit was mysteriously ruined, my mother had actually laughed at me. Patricia had stood in the kitchen sipping her expensive wine and told me I was just financially illiterate. She claimed I probably applied for too many credit cards in college and ruined my own life through sheer stupidity. My father had chimed in, saying I needed to be much more responsible like Cameron, who was actively building a massive tech empire. They watched me sob at the kitchen table. They watched me struggle for years to rebuild a credit profile I never actually destroyed. They watched me get denied for basic business loans and forced to pay exorbitant interest rates on cheap used cars because my score was trapped in the low 500s. They watched me suffer the agonizing real-world consequences of their federal crimes, and they never once showed a single ounce of remorse. They had deliberately ruined my 20s to protect the golden child. They stole my identity, committed massive financial fraud, and then happily gaslit me into believing I was the failure. I sat on the floor of the empty master bedroom, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of my family's ultimate betrayal. Any lingering trace of familial guilt evaporated from my body entirely. The small, tiny voice in my head that had always whispered that maybe I was being too harsh, or maybe they really did love me, went completely silent. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating determination. My parents did not just take advantage of my wealth. They actively stole my future before I even had a chance to build it. They felt entitled to my money now because they had already decided they owned me 12 years ago. I gathered the thick stacks of bank statements, the forged promissory notes, and the wire transfer receipts. I neatly stacked them back into their pristine plastic sleeves and placed them back into the heavy metal lockbox. I closed the lid and spun the dial, locking the criminal evidence away safely. I did not put the box back under the floorboards. I tucked it securely under my arm. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Donovan, my corporate real estate attorney. He answered almost immediately, his voice brisk and professional. He asked if the local police had successfully cleared the trespassers from the property. The police handled Courtney. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. The house is completely empty and secure. The movers are gone. Donovan let out a sharp sigh of relief. Excellent news, Lydia. We can proceed with the standard eviction notices for Patricia and Richard when they return from their cruise. We will have them legally barred from the property by the end of the month. I looked around the beautiful sunlit bedroom. I looked at the pristine hardwood floors and the expensive crown molding I had picked out specifically because my mother said she loved the coastal aesthetic. I had bought this massive house out of a misplaced sense of duty to people who had secretly treated me like a disposable financial asset. I do not want to evict them anymore, Donovan, I said, gripping the heavy metal lockbox tightly against my side. Eviction is far too generous. Donovan paused on the other end of the line. What exactly are you suggesting, Lydia? I walked out of the master suite, my footsteps echoing sharply down the long, empty hallway. I want you to contact Harrison immediately, I instructed. Harrison was the lead buyer for a massive corporate real estate investment group that had been trying to aggressively acquire properties in this specific neighborhood for the past 6 months. He had personally offered to buy this exact house from me before I moved my parents into it. Tell Harrison the coastal property is officially back on the market today, I said, walking through the grand foyer and out the front doors. Tell him he can have the entire estate, including all the premium custom staging furniture, for a pure cash offer. The only absolute condition is a lightning-fast 7-day closing period. Donovan sounded slightly shocked. Lydia, you are talking about selling $1 million asset in less than a week. The corporate group will want immediate possession of the estate. Your parents' personal belongings are still inside the house. I stood on the front porch and locked the heavy glass doors. My parents are on a luxury cruise in the Mediterranean, I replied, stepping out into the bright Florida sun. By the time their ship docks back in the United States, they will not have a home to return to. Initiate the cash sale, Donovan. Accept the offer right now. I walked down the driveway and climbed into my car. I tossed the heavy lockbox onto the passenger seat. The game was officially over. I drove out of the security gates of the coastal community and pulled into the parking lot of a high-end coffee shop just a few miles down the road. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a small corner table, and placed my father's heavy metal lockbox on the chair next to me. The absolute finality of my decision settled over my shoulders like a thick protective armor. For years, I had desperately tried to buy my parents' love and secure their approval by fixing their constant financial disasters. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure they had a beautiful place to live. Now, knowing they had deliberately stolen my identity to fund Cameron's delusion and actively ruined my 20s, I felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. The emotional chains that had bound me to them were completely severed. My phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was Donovan. He informed me that he had just spoken directly with Harrison, the lead buyer for the corporate real estate investment group. Harrison was highly motivated. His firm had been attempting to corner the luxury market in this specific zip code for months, and my property was the exact crown jewel they needed for their portfolio. Donovan told me Harrison was currently in the area and wanted to tour the estate immediately. I finished my coffee, picked up the lockbox, and drove straight back to the house. Harrison arrived precisely at 3 o'clock in a sleek black town car. He was a sharp, no-nonsense corporate operator dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He stepped out of his vehicle and greeted me with a firm, practiced handshake. He did not ask about my family. He did not ask why I was selling so abruptly, and he certainly did not care about the local police cruisers that had been parked in the driveway just hours prior. He was entirely focused on the asset. We walked through the heavy custom glass front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. Harrison's keen eyes scanned the high ceilings, the pristine white marble flooring, and the expensive crown molding. He noted the flawless condition of the property and the meticulous coastal aesthetic I had curated. He ran his hand along the imported Italian marble of the kitchen island, completely silent, as he mentally calculated the immense value of the estate. He walked through the expansive living areas, inspected the master suite, where I had uncovered the devastating lockbox, and stepped out onto the back patio to observe the manicured landscaping. The entire walkthrough took less than 20 minutes. Harrison turned to face me in the center of the kitchen, his expression strictly business. He told me the property was flawless and that the high-end staging furniture perfectly complemented the architectural design. He did not want to waste time negotiating back and forth. He looked me dead in the eye and offered $1.3 million in pure liquid cash. It was a massive premium over what I had paid just 89 days ago. The corporate group was willing to overpay simply to acquire the asset and secure their foothold in the neighborhood. I stood in the exact spot where Courtney had shrieked her manufactured outrage and calmly considered the tremendous offer. Harrison stated that the cash funds could be wired directly into my corporate accounts, and the entire transaction could be legally closed within a lightning-fast 7-day period. There was only one strict, non-negotiable condition attached to the premium price tag. Harrison pointed a finger at the master suite hallway. He told me that his firm required immediate, undisputed possession of the property. The house had to be completely devoid of all personal belongings by Friday afternoon. The corporate group planned to bring in their own architectural photographers over the weekend, and they could not have any residential clutter interfering with their commercial timeline. If there was so much as a single toothbrush left in the master bathroom, the entire deal would be instantly voided. I looked at Harrison and extended my hand. I told him we had a deal. Donovan had already emailed the preliminary commercial sales agreement to both of us. Harrison pulled a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket and slid the printed documents across the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island. I signed my name with sharp, decisive strokes, completely signing away the property that my parents believed they rightfully owned. The crisp sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the sound of a heavy steel door slamming shut on my family's unearned luxury. I did not waste a single second after Harrison drove away. With the Friday deadline looming, I immediately contacted a premium rapid response, packing, and junk removal service based out of downtown Boston. I paid a massive premium to have a 12-person crew dispatched to the coastal estate that very same evening. I sat on the bar stool in the kitchen drinking bottled water and orchestrating the total dismantling of my parents' lavish lifestyle. The packing crew arrived in 3 large unmarked vans. They were efficient professional and asked absolutely no questions about why they were rapidly emptying a $1 million home at 6 o'clock in the evening. I stood in the hallway and directed them to pack every single item belonging to Patricia and Richard. I watched with cold satisfaction as 2 workers carefully wrapped and boxed my father's absurdly expensive custom-tailored golf clubs. He had bragged for months about how those clubs would make him the star of the local retirement country club. Now they were being shoved into heavy-duty cardboard boxes. I walked into the massive walk-in closet and instructed a team of 3 women to clear out every single garment. I watched them pull Patricia's extensive collection of silk resort wear, expensive cashmere sweaters, and high-end designer handbags off the custom velvet hangers. My mother had spent thousands of dollars outfitting herself for her new wealthy persona, using the money she saved by living rent-free in my house. The workers swiftly folded the expensive fabrics and sealed them away in dark plastic shipping bins. They packed up the large, hard-shell cruise luggage boxes my parents had left behind, gathering all the excessive luxury items they had accumulated while secretly viewing me as their personal bank account. The house was systematically stripped bare. The premium staging furniture remained perfectly in place, but every trace of Patricia and Richard Wilson was completely erased from the property. They had treated my home like their own personal kingdom, and now they were being evicted by a team of strangers in matching gray uniforms. I instructed the lead foreman on exactly where the boxes needed to go. I did not send their belongings to a premium luxury storage facility. I had actively researched the cheapest, most basic storage options available in the greater metropolitan area. I rented a dingy, windowless $90 a month climate-controlled unit in a run-down industrial park across town. The facility was surrounded by rusted chain link fences, and the harsh fluorescent lights in the corridors constantly flickered. It was the absolute stark opposite of the glamorous coastal estate they felt entirely entitled to claim as their own. I followed the moving vans across town in my own car. The sun had completely set by the time we arrived at the bleak industrial park. I stood in the cold concrete hallway and watched the crews stack the heavy brown boxes from floor to ceiling inside the narrow, cramped storage unit. Patricia's designer handbags and Richard's premium golf clubs were unceremoniously piled into the small concrete box alongside their winter coats and cheap knickknacks. The sheer visual poetry of their fabricated wealth being locked away in a cheap metal cage was incredibly grounding. The foreman handed me the clipboard. I signed off on the premium rapid response packing service and handed him a generous cash tip for his crew's speed and discretion. I stood alone in the quiet, flickering hallway of the storage facility. I reached up, grabbed the handle of the heavy corrugated metal roll-up door, and pulled it down with a loud, echoing crash. I snapped a heavy brass padlock through the metal latch, clicking it securely into place. I slipped the small, jagged key into my pocket. My parents' entire lives were now locked inside a 10 by 10 concrete cube. I turned around to walk back to my car. The damp night air felt incredibly refreshing against my face. I had reclaimed my property, sold a massive corporate asset for a huge profit, and completely protected my financial future from further criminal exploitation. Just as I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the storage facility lobby and into the dark parking lot, my cell phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the brightly illuminated screen. It was an international text message. It was from Patricia, sent directly from a port in Greece. The message was typed entirely in frantic, demanding capital letters. The ship rejected our cards. They won't let us disembark in Athens until we clear a $14,000 bar and excursion balance. Fix this right now. The text message from Patricia glared up at me from the brightly illuminated screen of my cell phone. I stood alone in the dark, damp parking lot of the cheap storage facility, reading the frantic, all-caps demand. I did not type a response. I did not call her back. I simply slid the phone deep into my jacket pocket, walked to my car, and drove home. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my coastal estate, my phone had vibrated 12 distinct times. Patricia was leaving back-to-back voicemails. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and played them on speakerphone. The first voicemail was pure, seething indignation. Patricia demanded to know why my credit card, the one she had explicitly memorized the numbers for, was suddenly declining at the purser desk. She shrieked that she was being publicly humiliated in front of the cruise director and several wealthy passengers she had been trying to impress. The second voicemail escalated to sheer, unadulterated panic. She frantically explained that Cameron and Courtney had conveniently disappeared to the upper viewing decks and were absolutely refusing to answer their cabin phone. By the fifth voicemail, Patricia was outright sobbing into the receiver. She wailed that the Greek port authorities were getting involved, and the ship security explicitly refused to let her or Richard disembark in Athens until their massive $14,000 tab for premium liquor and private guided tours was completely settled. I deleted every single audio file without a shred of guilt. The sheer staggering entitlement required to rack up a five-figure bar tab on someone else's dime and then aggressively demand they fix it was beyond comprehension. The next morning, I woke up in my quiet, perfectly empty house. The premium staging furniture remained gracefully in place, but all traces of my parents' toxic presence were securely locked away in that concrete box across town. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and walked out onto the back patio. The Florida sun was already warm, reflecting beautifully off the pristine water of the pool. I sat in a cushioned lounge chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. My phone buzzed loudly against the glass table. It was my father. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, it rang again. I answered it on the third attempt, putting it on speaker and resting it flat on the table. Richard did not bother with a standard greeting. His voice boomed through the small speaker, dripping with that familiar aggressive gaslighting he had weaponized to control me my entire life. Lydia, stop throwing a tantrum, he barked, his tone laced with absolute unearned authority. Your brother is embarrassed in front of his wife's sister. The ship staff are treating us like common criminals. Wire the money to the ship's purser immediately, or you are completely cut out of this family's future. Do you understand me? You will not see a single dime of your inheritance. I sat there listening to the man who had actively stolen my identity, threatened to withhold an inheritance that did not even exist. He was still trying desperately to play the role of the wealthy, powerful patriarch, while literally trapped on a boat, unable to pay his own bar tab. He truly believed he still held all the controlling cards. I leaned forward and tapped the red button, ending the call mid-breath. I picked up the phone and opened my text messages. I typed out my response slowly and carefully, ensuring every single word carried the exact heavy weight of 12 years of stolen financial freedom. I am sorry, Dad, I typed. I would love to help, but my funds are tied up. Did you know the IRS flags suspicious lines of credit taken out on stolen Social Security numbers? You should probably look into that. Enjoy Athens. I hit send. I set the phone down and took another sip of my hot coffee. The retaliation was completely silent, but I could practically feel the massive shockwave radiating across the Atlantic Ocean. I imagined Richard staring at his glowing screen, reading those exact precise words. I imagined the blood rapidly draining from his face as he realized his ultimate secret, the one he thought he had buried securely under the floorboards of my master bedroom, was entirely exposed. He knew exactly what that text meant. He knew I had found the lockbox. He knew I possessed the promissory notes, the forged signatures, and the highly detailed bank transfers. He knew his entire fabricated life of luxury was built on federal fraud, and I held all the undeniable receipts. For 3 straight hours there was absolute silence from the Mediterranean. No more ringing calls, no more demanding text messages, no more hysterical sobbing voicemails from Patricia. The deafening quiet was the most satisfying sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. Then, right as I was walking back into the kitchen to rinse my coffee mug, my phone lit up again. This time, the caller ID flashed Cameron's name. I answered the call, fully expecting another barrage of entitled screaming, or perhaps more empty threats about his imaginary legal prowess. Instead, the voice that came through the speaker was shaking with actual, raw, unfiltered panic. Lydia, you have to help me. Cameron stammered, his breath catching sharply in his throat. Please, Lydia. You have to call the bank. You have to tell them the deed is real. His arrogant bravado had completely vanished. He was not a brilliant tech visionary or a highly successful cryptocurrency entrepreneur. He was a terrified 30-year-old man whose entire fabricated house of cards had just violently collapsed. What are you talking about, Cameron? I asked, keeping my voice totally detached and perfectly monotone. The bank froze everything, he gasped, sounding like he was pacing rapidly in a small enclosed space. The federal underwriter processing the home equity line of credit ran a deep title search this morning. They flagged the quitclaim deed Mom gave me. They said the notary seal was missing and the property was officially owned by a corporate entity. They froze my entire account, Lydia. Every single checking and savings account is locked down under heavy suspicion of bank fraud. I have zero access to any money. Courtney is crying in the cabin. The ship is demanding immediate payment for the luxury suite, and my cards are all declining. I leaned against the cool marble of the kitchen counter, letting the sheer magnitude of his absolute stupidity wash over me. Cameron had actually tried to push a poorly forged deed through a federal banking institution while actively sitting on a cruise ship. He thought he was so much smarter than everyone else that he could just easily bypass standard legal protocols through sheer arrogant entitlement. You committed mortgage fraud, Cameron, I stated plainly. You submitted a forged legal document to extract $500,000 against a corporate asset you absolutely do not own. The bank did exactly what they are legally required to do. You have to verify the HELOC. He begged, his voice cracking pathetically. Just call the underwriter. Tell them you authorize the transfer. Tell them the LLC is yours and you approve the $500,000 line of credit. I will pay you back, Lydia, I swear to God. I will pay you back every single cent with interest when crypto bounces back next quarter. You know my new venture is going to be massive. Just verify the loan so they unfreeze my accounts. He was still living in a complete fantasy world. He genuinely thought a simple friendly phone call could instantly erase federal bank fraud. He thought promising me imaginary future cryptocurrency profits would somehow magically convince me to willingly participate in his criminal enterprise. He had spent his entire life watching our parents bail him out of every single massive failure, and he truly believed I would step in and do the exact same thing. I am not bailing you out, Cameron, I said, my voice ice cold. I am not verifying a fraudulent loan. You and Mom and Dad can sit in that tiny cabin and figure out how to pay your own bills. Do not ever call this number again. I hung up the phone and instantly blocked his contact. I blocked Patricia and Richard as well. They were officially cut off. They were stranded in Greece with no money, no access to credit, and absolutely no way to continue their luxury vacation. They were going to have to face the severe music entirely on their own. I took a deep breath, feeling incredibly light. The fast cash sale of the house was progressing perfectly. The property was empty. The toxic family members were completely neutralized. All I had to do was wait for Harrison's corporate team to finalize the thick paperwork on Friday, and I could walk away from this entire nightmare with a massive financial profit. Exactly 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen. It was Brenda, the lead escrow officer at the title company, handling the cash transaction for Harrison's real estate group. We had spoken earlier that morning to thoroughly confirm the preliminary wire instructions. I answered the call, expecting her to ask a routine standard question about the final closing disclosures. Hi, Brenda, I said cheerfully. Is everything set for Friday? Lydia, we have a major problem, Brenda said, her voice incredibly tight with professional concern. I just pulled the updated property records to prepare the final clean title for the corporate buyer. The transaction is completely halted. I stood up straight, my cheerful demeanor instantly vanishing. What do you mean, halted? Harrison offered pure cash. The house is totally empty. I am the sole owner of the LLC. There is no mortgage on the property. There is no mortgage, Brenda confirmed, sounding deeply stressed. But there is a brand new mechanic's lien attached directly to the property address. It was officially recorded and actively filed with the county clerk yesterday afternoon. A lien, I repeated, my mind racing, trying desperately to understand how this was physically possible. For what? I am looking at the formal filing right now, Brenda said, the distinct sound of shuffling papers echoing through the phone. It is a strict contractor's lien from Apex Luxury Pools and Spas. It is for unpaid construction materials and heavy labor. The total exact amount filed against your property is $85,000. $85,000. The number hit me like a solid physical blow. I had never contacted a pool company. The pool in the backyard was perfectly fine. Brenda! I have never hired Apex Luxury Pools, I said, my voice rising in sharp panic. I have never authorized any construction on this property. I have the official work order attached to the lien filing, Brenda replied, reading quickly. The contract was signed 3 weeks ago. It explicitly authorizes a massive expansion of the existing pool deck, the installation of a custom hot tub, and imported glass tiling. The signature on the work order is Cameron Wilson. He falsely listed himself as the primary resident and authorized managing agent of the property. The room started to spin. While I was busy working and letting my parents live completely rent-free, my brother had secretly hired a luxury contractor to build him a custom hot tub. He had brazenly authorized $85,000 in massive construction modifications to a house he did not own, and he had completely failed to pay the contractor a single dime. He had likely promised the pool company they would be paid in full as soon as his fraudulent home equity loan cleared the bank. Now that his accounts were completely frozen by the federal underwriter, the contractor had panicked and immediately slapped a hard legal lien on my property to protect their unpaid labor. Lydia, you know Harrison's corporate group requires a pristine, perfectly clean title. Brenda warned, her tone incredibly serious. They are not going to absorb an $85,000 contractor dispute. If this heavy lien is not legally cleared and completely removed from the county records by Friday morning, Harrison will pull his $1.3 million cash offer. You will lose the entire sale. I stood in the perfectly empty kitchen staring out the large window at the pool Cameron had tried to illegally expand. He had trapped me. Even from a frozen cruise ship cabin in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, his boundless, staggering arrogance was actively destroying my financial future. I had exactly 3 days to figure out how to instantly eliminate an $85,000 legal hold, or the biggest real estate victory of my life would violently collapse into absolute ruin. I ended the call with Brenda and immediately dialed Donovan. My corporate attorney picked up on the first ring, and his usual brisk professionalism was entirely replaced by an urgent, demanding tone. He had already seen the emergency notification hit the title registry, and he was absolutely furious on my behalf. He did not mince words. He told me Harrison was a corporate shark who dealt exclusively in clean assets and zero liabilities. Harrison's firm was buying a premium piece of coastal real estate, not a messy family legal dispute involving fraudulent construction contracts. Donovan warned me that I had exactly 48 hours to make the mechanic's lien completely disappear. If the title was not perfectly clear by Thursday afternoon, Harrison would walk away from the deal, keep his massive cash offer, and likely blacklist my staging company from any future corporate contracts. I told Donovan to prepare a draft for a sworn legal affidavit regarding contract fraud and text it to my phone immediately. I grabbed my keys and headed straight for my car. I was not going to let Cameron's boundless delusion cost me over $1 million. Apex Luxury Pools and Spas was located in a high-end commercial district just outside the city limits. The drive took exactly 40 minutes, and I used every single second to ruthlessly calculate my leverage. For years, I had watched Cameron operate exactly like this. He would swagger into rooms making grandiose promises, writing checks his bank accounts could never cash, and leaving a trail of furious vendors in his wake. Our parents had always scrambled to cover his tracks, claiming he was just an ambitious visionary who occasionally overextended his creative reach. They had constantly demanded I bail him out of his early missteps, using the hard-earned profits from my boutique staging business. I had spent my entire 20s carrying heavy furniture up narrow staircases, dealing with demanding real estate agents, and building a bulletproof industry reputation through sheer exhausting labor. I knew exactly how contractors operated. I knew their margins were tight, their schedules were brutal, and their tolerance for wealthy frauds was absolutely zero. I pulled into the polished concrete parking lot of the pool company and walked directly through the heavy glass double doors. The showroom was expansive and filled with high-resolution digital displays of infinity pools and custom grottos. I bypassed the receptionist and walked straight toward the back offices, looking for the person in charge. A burly man with thick graying hair and an exhausted expression stepped out of a glass-walled office. His embroidered polo shirt identified him as Marcus, the owner. I introduced myself as Lydia Wilson, the sole legal owner of the coastal property he had just placed a massive lien against. Marcus immediately crossed his arms and his face flushed with deep, aggressive anger. He told me he did not care who technically owned the property. He launched into a furious tirade about my brother. He explained that Cameron had strutted into his showroom 3 weeks ago wearing a bespoke suit and acting like he owned the entire coastal neighborhood. Cameron had demanded an expedited timeline for a luxury grotto, complete with imported glass tiles, smart temperature controls, and a cascading waterfall feature. Marcus said Cameron had confidently signed the work orders authorized the massive $85,000 build, and then completely vanished when it came time to pay the mandatory $20,000 deposit. Marcus had already ordered the custom materials and scheduled his heavy machinery. When Cameron stopped answering his calls, Marcus did what any smart contractor would do. He protected his business by slapping a heavy lien on the house to ensure he was fully compensated for his financial exposure. I stood perfectly still and let Marcus vent his entirely justified rage. When he finally took a breath, I looked him dead in the eye and laid out my terms. I told him I ran one of the most successful boutique staging firms in the state. I dropped 3 massive commercial developers I frequently partnered with. Marcus instantly recognized the names. The aggressive posture slowly melted from his shoulders as he realized he was speaking to an industry peer, not another delusional scam artist trying to avoid a bill. I explained that Cameron had committed blatant fraud. He had absolutely zero legal authority to authorize construction on my property. He had forged his status as the managing agent to secure the contract. I told Marcus that litigating the $85,000 lien would tie his company up in expensive legal battles for years, and he would likely never see a single dime because Cameron's accounts were currently frozen by federal investigators. However, I offered him an immediate, extremely profitable alternative. I opened my designer tote bag and pulled out my corporate checkbook. I offered to write him a cashier's check for $20,000 right there on the spot. I would pay the missing deposit out of my own pocket to cover his sunk costs, the custom glass tiles, and his wasted time. In exchange, he had to log into the county portal and release the lien immediately. But there was one final non-negotiable condition. I pulled out my phone and forwarded him the drafted legal affidavit Donovan had sent me. I told Marcus he had to sign the sworn document officially stating that Cameron Wilson had fraudulently misrepresented himself and illegally signed the work orders. Marcus read the digital document carefully. He looked at the blank check sitting on his desk. A grim, satisfied smile spread across his face. He printed the affidavit, signed his name with a heavy black pen, and handed it to me. I wrote the check for $20,000 and slid it across the desk. Within 15 minutes, Marcus had his office manager electronically submit the lien release to the county clerk. The legal erasure of my parents' completely fabricated life was officially underway. By Thursday morning, Donovan called to confirm the title was completely clear. The heavy, suffocating cloud of Cameron's fraud had been entirely burned away by my $20,000 strategic strike. I had the sworn affidavit safely locked in my digital vault, providing me with absolute bulletproof leverage against any future retaliation my brother might attempt to launch. Friday morning arrived with brilliant, blinding sunshine. The lightning-fast 7-day close proceeded flawlessly. Harrison's corporate real estate group wired the funds directly to the title company without a single delay or complication. I sat in Donovan's sleek downtown office, drinking sparkling water and signing the final stack of closing disclosures. The moment the escrow officer confirmed the wire transfer, I checked my corporate banking application. $1.3 million sat securely in my account. The property was officially sold. My parents' massive sprawling house of lies was completely gone. I returned to my own luxury apartment overlooking the city skyline. I opened my laptop and methodically erased their entire existence from my financial ecosystem. I logged into the utility portals and immediately terminated the water power and high-speed internet services at the coastal estate. I canceled the premium landscaping contract and the weekly pool maintenance. Then, I officially unregistered my parents' residential lease agreement, completely severing their legal ties to the property. I navigated to the Postal Service website and submitted a permanent change of address form for Richard and Patricia Wilson. I did not forward their mail to my apartment. I forwarded every single piece of their mail directly to the dingy, windowless, $90 a month climate-controlled storage unit in the rundown industrial park. Their expensive catalogs, their cruise line brochures, and their inevitable past-due credit card bills would now be delivered straight to the cold concrete box that held the remnants of their stolen luxury. The next week passed in blissful absolute silence. I focused entirely on my staging business, securing 2 massive new commercial contracts and watching my corporate accounts grow steadily. I did not think about the Greek port authorities or the frozen home equity line of credit. I was entirely free from the exhausting burden of managing my family's constant manufactured catastrophes. Then, on the evening of the 14th day, my cell phone lit up on my kitchen counter. The Mediterranean cruise was officially over. The message was from Patricia. We had to borrow money from Aunt Carol just to buy economy tickets home. We are exhausted and furious. Have dinner ready at the house at 7 p.m. so we can discuss your punishment. The blazing Florida sun beat down mercilessly on the regional airport tarmac. Patricia, Richard, and Cameron dragged themselves through the sliding glass doors of the arrivals terminal, looking absolutely nothing like the wealthy elite they desperately pretended to be. Their skin was peeling and burnt an angry lobster red from being stranded in Greece without access to their premium indoor cabanas. They were wearing cheap, wrinkled tourist clothing they had been forced to buy with borrowed cash. The sheer humiliation of flying for 14 hours in cramped economy seats next to the restrooms had completely fractured Patricia's fragile ego. She was practically vibrating with toxic rage, snapping at every passing traveler who dared to walk too close to her. Richard trailed behind her, pulling a single battered carry-on bag. His usual commanding patriarch persona was entirely deflated. He looked like a tired, beaten old man. Cameron was in even worse shape. He had spent the entire transatlantic flight sweating profusely and aggressively biting his fingernails. His phone had been dead for 2 days, and the terrifying reality of his frozen bank accounts was slowly eating him alive. They emerged onto the humid sidewalk where Courtney was already waiting for them. Courtney had been forced to take a cheap shuttle to the airport after the local police had formally evicted her from the coastal estate days earlier. She was standing by the curb, clutching 2 massive garbage bags, filled with the few personal items she had managed to grab before the officers threatened her with trespassing charges. When she saw Cameron walking out of the terminal, she did not run to hug him. She threw the heavy plastic bags onto the concrete and began screaming. She demanded to know why she had been humiliated by law enforcement while he was off drinking premium champagne on a luxury cruise. Cameron flinched under her verbal assault, completely lacking the arrogant energy he usually used to silence her. Richard stepped between them, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He ordered Courtney to shut her mouth and get into the vehicle. He had ordered a rideshare using the last $50 of Aunt Carol's pity money. The vehicle that pulled up was not a sleek black town car. It was a dented, compact sedan that smelled strongly of cheap air freshener and stale cigarette smoke. The 4 of them were forced to cram themselves into the tiny back seat and passenger area. Patricia sat with her knees pushed up against her chest, loudly complaining about the lack of legroom and declaring that Lydia was going to pay for every single second of this agonizing discomfort. The cramped vehicle merged onto the busy highway heading toward the coastal community. Cameron finally managed to plug his dead cell phone into a portable charger he had borrowed from Courtney. The screen lit up and instantly began vibrating with dozens of missed call notifications. Before he could even check his voicemail, the phone rang loudly in the small, confined space of the car. The caller ID displayed an out-of-state area code. Cameron answered it, pressing the speaker to his ear with a trembling hand. The voice on the other end of the line was incredibly sharp, professional, and entirely devoid of any customer service warmth. It was a senior federal investigator calling directly from the fraud division of Cameron's primary banking institution. The investigator stated that the call was being officially recorded for federal compliance and demanded that Cameron verify his identity. Cameron stammered his confirmation, his eyes darting frantically around the cramped vehicle. The investigator did not waste a single second. He formally notified Cameron that all of his personal and business accounts were permanently locked, pending a massive federal review. The investigator listed the exact charges with ruthless precision: wire fraud, interstate forgery, fraudulent application for a home equity line of credit. The bank had received a sworn legal affidavit explicitly stating that Cameron had forged a quitclaim deed across state lines and illegally authorized a massive construction contract on a property he did not legally own. The color instantly drained from Cameron's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He desperately tried to activate his usual charm offensive. He laughed nervously and told the federal investigator that this was all just a massive family misunderstanding. He claimed his sister owned the corporate entity, and she had simply forgotten that she gave him verbal permission to expand the pool deck. He promised to have Lydia call the bank and clear everything up by the end of the business day. The federal investigator completely shut him down. He informed Cameron that verbal permission did not legally validate a forged state document. Furthermore, the investigators stated that the sworn affidavit they received was provided directly by the primary property owner and the defrauded construction contractor. Lydia had not just ignored his desperate pleas for help. She had actively and meticulously provided the federal authorities with the exact evidence they needed to build a criminal case against him. The investigator told Cameron to retain legal counsel immediately and abruptly ended the call. The silence inside the cheap ride share was absolutely deafening. Patricia turned her sunburned face toward her golden child, her mouth hanging slightly open. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together audibly. Courtney let out a sharp, cruel laugh from the front seat and muttered that she was married to a broke criminal. Cameron dropped his phone into his lap. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the walls of his massive delusion finally caved in. He realized that Lydia was not just throwing a temporary tantrum. She had methodically dismantled his entire life. She had burned his fraudulent empire to the ground and handed the ashes directly to the federal government. He was facing actual prison time, and there was absolutely no way his parents could bail him out. Patricia refused to accept the reality of the situation. Her mind simply could not process the fact that her obedient, disposable daughter had utterly defeated them. She violently shook her head and declared that the bank investigator was wrong. She shrieked that Lydia was just bluffing and that once they arrived at the house, she would personally force Lydia to call the bank and fix this entire mess. Patricia demanded the driver go faster. She was entirely consumed by the need to enact her brutal punishment. She truly believed that if she just screamed loudly enough, the universe would magically bend back to her will. The battered sedan finally turned off the main highway and entered the exclusive coastal neighborhood. The manicured lawns and towering palm trees stood in stark contrast to the miserable, humiliated family trapped inside the tiny car. The driver pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of the luxury estate and parked near the grand front entrance. Richard handed the man the remaining crumpled cash, and the family climbed out of the vehicle. Their cheap suitcases hit the pristine brick pavers with a dull thud. Patricia did not even wait for the others. She marched directly up the walkway, her posture rigid with toxic entitlement. She reached the massive custom glass front doors and aggressively jabbed her personal access code into the digital smart lock keypad. She fully expected the heavy internal mechanism to click open and grant her entry to the kingdom she believed she rightfully owned. The keypad flashed a harsh, solid red light. The locking mechanism remained completely silent. Patricia scowled and punched the numbers in again, hitting the digital buttons with angry, forceful strikes. The lock flashed red a second time. She let out a frustrated growl and yelled for Richard to come open the door. Richard lumbered up the steps, his face dripping with sweat, and shoved Patricia aside. He entered his own master code. The machine blinked red. He tried Cameron's code. Red again. The digital smart lock had been completely wiped and reprogrammed. They were officially locked out of the estate. Patricia's face twisted into a mask of pure unhinged fury. She began pounding her fists against the thick, reinforced glass, demanding that Lydia open the door immediately. She screamed that she was not going to stand outside like a common beggar. When nobody answered her demands, she cupped her hands around her face and pressed her nose directly against the custom glass to peer into the grand foyer. What she saw completely shattered her remaining grip on reality. The massive crystal chandelier still hung from the vaulted ceiling, but everything else was entirely wrong. The expensive premium coastal staging furniture she had meticulously chosen to impress her friends was completely gone. The imported silk rugs, the plush white sofas, and the expensive abstract artwork had all vanished. The pristine, elegant interior had been replaced by a chaotic maze of heavy brown cardboard moving boxes and cheap generic plastic furniture. Patricia's eyes darted wildly across the open floor plan until she looked toward the formal dining room. Sitting exactly where Patricia used to host her lavish dinner parties was a completely unfamiliar family. A man in a faded t-shirt, a woman with her hair pulled up in a messy bun, and two young children were sitting around a cheap folding table eating delivery pizza directly out of the cardboard box. They were laughing and talking, completely unaware of the hysterical woman staring at them from the front porch. Patricia's mind violently rejected the visual information. She refused to comprehend that the house had been sold right out from under her feet. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysterical desperation. She pounded both of her fists against the heavy glass doors with such extreme force that her knuckles began to bleed. The family inside the dining room suddenly stopped eating and turned their heads toward the front entrance, their eyes widening in shock at the sight of the unhinged, sunburned woman attacking their new home. Patricia kept screaming and thrashing against the locked doors as the total devastating reality of her absolute ruin finally crushed her. She slammed her bleeding knuckles against the reinforced glass, leaving frantic red smears across the pristine surface. Her lungs burned as she shrieked, demanding the strangers inside vacate her property immediately. The family sitting at the dining table simply stared at her in stunned silence. The man in the faded t-shirt set his slice of pizza down and pulled his phone from his pocket, completely ignoring her hysterical demands. Richard rushed up the concrete steps and grabbed Patricia by the shoulders, physically pulling her away from the door. He hissed at her to lower her voice frantically, glancing around the quiet, manicured street. He was utterly terrified of looking like a fool in front of the wealthy neighbors he had spent the last 3 months trying to impress. Patricia violently shoved his hands away. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a tangled mess sticking to her sunburned face in sweaty clumps. Her eyes were wide and manic, entirely unhinged from reality. She reached into her cheap souvenir tote bag and retrieved her cell phone. Her hands shook so violently she dropped the device twice on the brick pavers before finally managing to dial the 3 digits of emergency dispatch. "I need police at my house immediately," Patricia screamed into the receiver, her voice echoing loudly down the quiet street. "We have a massive home invasion. There are dangerous squatters inside my luxury estate. They have locked us out and stolen everything. Send a SWAT team. Send everyone. They are eating pizza in my dining room." Richard grabbed his own hair in sheer panic, realizing Patricia was actively filing a false police report, but he was completely powerless to stop her manic spiral. Cameron remained frozen on the meticulously trimmed lawn. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the grass, clutching his dead cell phone to his chest. He was completely trapped in his own private nightmare, replaying the federal investigators' terrifying threats over and over in his mind. Courtney leaned against the trunk of the dented rideshare vehicle, crossing her arms and watching the entire spectacle with a cold, twisted grin. She loudly announced that she hoped the police arrested all of them so she could finally get a peaceful night of sleep. The suffocating Florida heat beat down on the driveway as the minutes ticked by. The upscale 55-plus community was usually a haven of absolute silence and enforced tranquility. Now front doors up and down the street began to slowly open. Wealthy retirees in expensive golf attire stepped out onto their manicured lawns, drawn by the sound of Patricia's relentless shrieking. They murmured to one another, pointing directly at the sunburned, disheveled family, causing a massive public disturbance. Richard tried to offer a pathetic, reassuring wave to a man he had previously bragged to at the country club, but the neighbor simply turned his back and walked inside. The social death Richard feared more than anything else was happening right in front of his eyes. The distant wail of sirens pierced the humid afternoon air. The sound grew rapidly louder until 2 large police cruisers turned sharply onto the street. Their red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly against the manicured palm trees. The heavy vehicles aggressively jumped the curb and skidded to a halt directly in the sweeping, circular driveway, blocking the cheap rideshare sedan from leaving. 4 uniformed officers jumped out of the cruisers instantly. Their hands hovered cautiously over their duty belts, reacting to the high-priority home invasion dispatch Patricia had maliciously fabricated. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, commanded everyone to step away from the front entrance. Patricia immediately ran toward him, waving her arms frantically and pointing at the custom glass doors. "Arrest them!" she wailed, her voice hoarse and broken. Break the door down and drag them out in handcuffs. They are stealing my retirement home. They stole all my designer furniture. The officer held up a hand instructing her to remain silent while his partner approached the front entrance. Before the second officer could even knock, the heavy front door swung smoothly open. Harrison stepped out onto the porch. He was no longer wearing his sharp charcoal corporate suit. He was dressed in casual weekend clothes, holding a half-eaten slice of pepperoni pizza in his left hand. He looked completely unbothered by the flashing police lights and the hysterical woman screaming on his lawn. He simply looked deeply annoyed that his family dinner had been interrupted by neighborhood lunatics. The lead officer stepped forward and asked Harrison to identify himself and explain his legal right to occupy the residence. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not act defensive. He calmly reached into his back pocket, pulled out his leather wallet, and handed his state identification to the officer. "I am the legal owner of this property," Harrison stated, his voice carrying the absolute unshakable confidence of a man who dealt in million-dollar corporate acquisitions daily. "I purchased this estate in a pure cash transaction. We formally closed yesterday morning. My firm holds the absolute clean title, and we took immediate possession of the asset." Patricia let out a guttural sound of pure denial. She lunged forward, trying to push past the police officers to get to Harrison. "He is lying," she screamed, spitting the words out with toxic venom. "My daughter bought this house for me. It belongs to us. He is a criminal squatter." Harrison sighed heavily, taking a slow bite of his pizza. He turned his head and called back into the house, asking his wife to bring his leather briefcase to the door. A moment later, the woman with the messy bun stepped out and handed him a thick manila folder. Harrison extracted a crisp, newly printed document featuring heavy notary seals and official county clerk stamps. He handed the pristine paperwork directly to the lead police officer. "Here is the legally recorded deed," Harrison said, entirely ignoring Patricia's existence. "You will see it was formally transferred from Lydia Wilson's corporate entity directly to my holding firm. The transaction is completely bulletproof. Now, if you do not mind, I would like these trespassers permanently removed from my property so my children can finish their dinner in peace." The lead officer carefully reviewed the certified deed cross-referencing the names and the official seals. He handed the document back to Harrison with a respectful nod. The officer turned around and faced Patricia and Richard. His previous cautious demeanor was instantly replaced by a hard, uncompromising glare. "Ma'am, you filed a false report of a violent home invasion," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave. "This is a civil matter, and you have absolutely zero legal right to be on this property. The rightful owner has asked you to leave. You need to gather your belongings and vacate the premises immediately, or you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Patricia's jaw dropped. She looked at Richard, expecting him to unleash his commanding patriarch fury and fix the situation. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to physically intimidate the armed police officer. He lowered his voice into his deepest, most authoritative register, completely ignoring the fact that he was wearing a wrinkled tourist shirt and sporting a peeling sunburn. "Now listen here, officer," Richard blustered, pointing a thick finger at Harrison. "There has clearly been a massive administrative error. My daughter Lydia handles our finances. She would never sell our home without consulting me. I demand you let us inside while I make a phone call to clear this up." The officer did not flinch. He placed his hand firmly on his duty belt and took a deliberate step toward Richard. "I will not ask you again, sir. Step off the property right now." Cameron suddenly scrambled up from the grass, his sheer panic temporarily overridden by his desperate need to sound like the smartest person in the room. He marched up to the police officers, aggressively waving his hands in the air. He tried to deploy the pseudo-legal tech bro jargon he usually used to confuse investors. "You cannot legally force us to leave," Cameron declared, his voice cracking slightly. "We maintain an equitable interest in this property. I hold a secondary quitclaim deed establishing my partial ownership. This cash sale is completely fraudulent. You have to honor our squatters' rights until a federal judge reviews the title chain." The lead officer looked at Cameron like he was a complete idiot. "Squatters' rights do not apply to people standing in a driveway with luggage," the officer stated bluntly. And if you are claiming to hold a secondary deed to a property that was just legally sold free and clear, I highly suggest you contact a lawyer instead of arguing with the police. Now move. Cameron opened his mouth to argue further, but a sudden sound cut through the heavy, humid air. The distinct low hum of a high-end luxury engine echoed down the street. A sleek, immaculate black town car glided smoothly up to the curb, parking directly behind the flashing police cruisers. The tinted windows rolled up tight, reflecting the afternoon sun. The driver, wearing a dark suit, stepped out and quickly moved to open the rear passenger door. I stepped out of the vehicle. I was not wearing wrinkled tourist clothes. I was dressed in a sharp, flawlessly tailored navy blue suit, holding a slim leather portfolio. I looked rested, wealthy, and entirely in control. Donovan, my corporate attorney, stepped out from the opposite side of the car, buttoning his suit jacket and adjusting his expensive silk tie. The stark visual contrast between my pristine professional appearance and my family's disheveled, sunburned misery was absolute perfection. Patricia's manic eyes locked onto me the second my expensive heels hit the pavement. Her expression instantly morphed from sheer terror back to aggressive, entitled demands. She genuinely believed that her personal ATM had finally arrived to fix the glitch and restore her unearned luxury. She broke away from Richard and sprinted across the lawn toward me, her cheap sandals sliding on the wet grass. "Lydia!" Patricia shrieked, waving her arms frantically. "Tell them, Lydia! Tell these stupid officers that you bought this house for us. Show them the real papers. Tell them to arrest that man and let us back inside our home right now." She reached out, intending to grab my arm and pull me toward the police officers. Donovan stepped smoothly between us, blocking her path entirely. He held up a hand, projecting the exact same unshakable authority that Harrison had displayed minutes earlier. "Do not touch my client!" Donovan warned, his voice sharp and cold. I ignored Patricia completely. I did not look at Richard, who was staring at me with a mix of shock and rising fury. I did not look at Cameron, who had suddenly gone entirely silent, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that I held the power to send him to federal prison. I walked calmly past my hysterical mother and approached the lead police officer. I offered him a polite professional smile. "Officers," I said, my voice perfectly steady and entirely devoid of any familial affection, "I am the former owner of this property. I sold it to Harrison 3 days ago in a fully authorized cash transaction. These people are trespassing." The lead officer looked from me to Harrison and then down at the pristine legal deed in his hands. The pieces of the puzzle instantly snapped together in his mind. The tense defensive posture of the 4 police officers immediately dissolved into deep, unmistakable irritation. They had responded to a high-priority emergency dispatch for a violent home invasion and a potential hostage situation. Instead, they had arrived at a luxury estate to find a bitter family dispute over a legally finalized real estate transaction. The lead officer handed the deed back to Harrison with a respectful nod and turned his entire imposing frame toward my parents. He did not look amused. He looked like a man who was dangerously close to making multiple arrests. The officer hooked his thumbs into his heavy-duty belt and took a slow, deliberate step toward Patricia. He informed her in a low, carrying voice that filing a false police report to trigger a tactical emergency response was a severe criminal offense. He stated that there was no home invasion. There were no dangerous squatters. There was only a group of unauthorized individuals harassing the legal residents of a privately owned property. The officer pointed a stern finger directly at the dented ride-share vehicle idling in the driveway. He issued his final absolute command. He ordered Patricia, Richard, and Cameron to get off the property immediately, or they would all leave the upscale community in the back of a police cruiser. Richard tried to puff out his chest one last time, but the sheer physical exhaustion and the threat of imminent arrest finally broke his manufactured bravado. His shoulders slumped, and he reached out to grab Patricia by the arm. He muttered that they needed to leave and call a lawyer from a safe location. Patricia stubbornly dug her cheap sandals into the immaculate brick pavers, shaking her head in violent denial. She refused to accept that her grand return to her stolen luxury estate was ending with a police escort off the premises. But it was not Patricia or Richard who escalated the situation into a complete point of no return. It was Cameron. Cameron had been standing near the edge of the lawn, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his earlier phone call with the federal bank investigator. His mind was a frantic, swirling vortex of locked bank accounts, wire fraud charges, and the terrifying prospect of a federal indictment. When he saw the police officers shifting their hands toward their handcuffs to enforce the trespassing order, his fragile golden child facade entirely, violently shattered. His panic-overridden brain made a disastrous miscalculation. He genuinely believed the officers were not just there to escort them off the driveway, but were actively preparing to arrest him for the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent home equity loan. The sheer pressure of the collapsing lies finally broke him. Cameron scrambled backward, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He threw his hands up in the air in a gesture of absolute surrender and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He did not try to defend his family. He did not try to maintain the wealthy tech visionary persona he had cultivated for a decade. He turned into a terrified, cornered animal and immediately threw his own mother directly to the wolves to save his own skin. "I did not forge the deed," Cameron screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Patricia's face. "She made me do it. She told me to sign the papers. My mom told me Lydia owed us the house. It was entirely her idea. I did not want to do it, but she promised me it was legal. She said she had verbal authorization. She made me create the corporate documents. I am just a victim in this." The absolute silence that fell over the driveway was staggering. Even the police officers froze momentarily, stunned by the sudden, unsolicited confession to major financial crimes. Patricia stood completely paralyzed. The deep red sunburn on her face seemed to drain away, leaving her a sickly pale color. She stared at her favorite child, her absolute golden boy, the son she had protected, bailed out, and worshipped her entire life. She had sacrificed my financial stability, my credit, and my future just to ensure Cameron never had to face a single consequence for his reckless actions. Now, the very second he faced actual severe legal jeopardy, he did not hesitate to publicly declare her the mastermind of a federal fraud ring. The betrayal was so absolute, so deeply profound, that Patricia physically swayed on her feet. Richard let out a roar of panicked fury. He lunged forward and grabbed Cameron by the collar of his wrinkled tourist shirt, aggressively shaking him. He ordered his son to shut his stupid mouth immediately. Richard frantically looked at the police officers, sweating profusely and stammering that his son was just dehydrated from the long flight and suffering from severe heat exhaustion. He insisted that Cameron was speaking pure, absolute nonsense and needed medical attention, not a criminal interrogation. The police officers, however, were no longer treating this as a simple trespassing dispute. The lead officer pulled out a small black notepad and unclipped his radio. He ordered Richard to step back and release his son immediately. The officers recognized that a spontaneous confession to forging real estate deeds and committing wire fraud was entirely out of their standard patrol jurisdiction, but it was absolutely actionable intelligence. They separated Cameron from his furious father and began asking sharp, precise questions about the exact nature of the documents he had just admitted to forging. This was the exact moment Donovan decided to strike. My attorney had been standing silently by my side, observing the entire spectacular collapse with the cold, detached calculation of an apex predator. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and stepped smoothly forward directly into the center of the chaotic driveway. "Officers, if I may clarify the situation," Donovan said, his voice projecting flawless legal authority. He opened his slim leather portfolio and extracted a thick manila folder. "I am corporate counsel for the former owner of this property. The young man currently panicking on your lawn is Cameron Wilson. He is entirely correct about the forged documents, but he is significantly downplaying his own active criminal involvement." Donovan handed the manila folder directly to the lead officer. The officer opened it and his eyes widened as he scanned the top document. Inside that folder is a sworn, legally binding affidavit from Marcus Thorne, the owner of Apex Luxury Pools and Spas, Donovan stated clearly, ensuring his voice carried across the driveway to where the neighborhood residents were standing on their lawns watching the spectacle. That document explicitly details how Cameron Wilson fraudulently misrepresented himself as the legal managing agent of this property. He illegally authorized an $85,000 luxury construction contract using a forged quitclaim deed. He then attempted to leverage that forged deed to extract a $500,000 home equity line of credit from a federal banking institution. My client discovered the fraud halted the illegal construction and personally paid the contractor to clear the title so this estate could be legally sold to its current rightful owner. Cameron let out a pathetic whimpering sound. Courtney, who was still leaning against the dented rideshare vehicle, let out a sharp gasp of pure disgust. She grabbed her 2 plastic garbage bags of belongings, turned her back on her husband, and began rapidly walking down the sidewalk, entirely abandoning him to his fate. She knew a sinking ship when she saw one, and she was not going to let Cameron drag her down into a federal fraud indictment. The lead officer finished reading the sworn contractor affidavit. He closed the folder and looked directly at Cameron. He informed the terrified 30-year-old man that while the local police department would not be executing an immediate arrest for the federal banking violations, they would be officially documenting this entire interaction. The officer explicitly warned Cameron that all of this evidence, including his spontaneous public confession regarding his mother's involvement, would be immediately forwarded to the district attorney and the federal fraud division. He told Cameron to expect a very serious knock on his door from federal investigators in the immediate future. Then the officer pointed toward the street and gave his final, unyielding order. He told them to get in their vehicle and leave the premises, or they would be arrested for trespassing right now. Richard grabbed Cameron by the arm, roughly hauling him toward the idling sedan. Cameron was sobbing openly, his chest heaving as the reality of his destroyed life fully settled over him. Richard shoved his son into the back seat and turned back to collect his wife. Patricia had not moved a single muscle. She was standing in the center of the pristine driveway, entirely surrounded by the wreckage of her fabricated reality. She slowly turned her head and looked at the beautiful coastal estate she had stolen. She looked at Harrison, who was watching her with total disgust. She looked at the wealthy neighbors standing on their perfectly manicured lawns, whispering and pointing at her spectacular humiliation. She looked at the police officers who had just documented her son confessing to a federal crime that she allegedly orchestrated. Finally, she looked directly at me. I stood there in my flawless designer suit, flanked by my high-powered attorney, completely untouched by the absolute ruin consuming her life. I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I simply watched her the way one watches a toxic storm finally blow itself out. Patricia realized she had absolutely no leverage left. She had no money. She had no house. She had no power over me. Her husband was a broken shell, and her golden child had betrayed her to save himself. She had lost every single game she had ever played. So she resorted to the absolute only tactic she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She decided to play the ultimate victim. Patricia's knees buckled. She dramatically collapsed onto the hard brick pavers of the driveway, landing with a heavy thud. She threw her head back and let out a piercing theatrical wail of pure agony. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing massive crocodile tears to stream down her sunburned cheeks. She reached her hands out toward me, her fingers grasping at the empty, humid air. She began to sob loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the neighborhood, desperately trying to manipulate the wealthy onlookers into believing she was just a poor, helpless mother being violently abused by her cruel, ungrateful daughter. Patricia was on her knees, clutching her chest as she sobbed loudly enough for the entire coastal cul-de-sac to hear. She was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. Thick crocodile tears streamed down her sunburned, peeling face, carving erratic tracks through her smeared, expensive makeup. She wailed that I was a monster, a cruel, heartless daughter who was throwing her own flesh and blood out onto the unforgiving street. She screamed that she had given me life, that she had sacrificed her best youthful years to raise me, and that this nightmare was how I repaid her maternal devotion. "Lydia! Please!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. "We raised you. We fed you. We put clothes on your back when you were nothing. You cannot leave your family on the street like this. You owe us." Richard, sensing a necessary shift in tactics, quickly abandoned his aggressive posturing and joined the theatrical display. He lowered his head, adopting the heavy posture of a defeated, heartbroken patriarch. He pleaded with me to remember the good times, insisting that family sticks together through thick and thin, no matter the circumstances. He begged me to call off the police, promising that we could sit down inside the house as a reasonable family and work out a mutually beneficial financial arrangement. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the brick pavers and the man standing beside her. They were desperately trying to weaponize the gazes of the wealthy neighbors who were still watching the spectacle from their manicured lawns. They wanted the crowd to see an ungrateful, wealthy daughter abusing her destitute, loving parents. But the crowd was not buying the unhinged performance, and neither was I. When Patricia screamed that they had fed me and raised me, a bitter memory flashed vividly through my mind. I remembered being 19 years old, working double shifts at a greasy local diner to pay for my basic community college classes, because Richard and Patricia had secretly drained my childhood savings account to fund Cameron's first failed tech startup. I remembered coming home physically exhausted, only to find the kitchen cabinets padlocked because Patricia did not want me eating the expensive organic groceries she had specifically purchased for her golden boy. I remembered the freezing winter nights in my unheated attic bedroom, listening to them downstairs popping imported champagne to celebrate Cameron's imaginary corporate milestones. They had not raised me. I had survived them. I had clawed my way out of their toxic, suffocating household, built a booming commercial staging business from absolutely nothing, and secured my own financial independence while they actively tried to sabotage my success at every turn. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy or hesitation. I maintained my perfectly composed posture, my face a mask of absolute chilling indifference. I stepped forward, my designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The crisp sound cut through Patricia's hysterical sobbing like a knife. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from her kneeling form. I slowly opened my leather designer bag. I reached inside and retrieved 2 specific items. The first was a single dull brass key attached to a cheap, bright yellow plastic keychain. The second was a crisp, freshly printed $100 bill. I held them out for a brief moment, letting the bright Florida sunlight catch the metal and the paper, ensuring Patricia saw exactly what I was holding in my hand. Then I simply opened my fingers and let them drop. The brass key hit the brick driveway with a sharp metallic clink. The $100 bill fluttered down, landing right next to Patricia's trembling knees. "Here is the key to your storage unit," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing clearly across the quiet driveway. "It is Unit 402 at the industrial park on the edge of town. I paid the $90 monthly fee through the end of the current month. All of your junk mail, your past due credit card statements, and the few cheap belongings you left behind are sitting inside that concrete box." Patricia stopped sobbing mid-breath. She stared at the cheap brass key and the single $100 bill on the ground as if they were venomous snakes. "And here is $100, I continued, gesturing to the cash on the bricks. "That will cover the cost of an extra-large Uber to transport you, your husband, your criminal son, and your luggage to the storage facility. After today, you are entirely on your own. Do not ever contact me again." Before Patricia could even process the sheer brutality of my statement, a new vehicle pulled rapidly into the driveway. It was an unmarked dark gray sedan. A man in a plain suit stepped out, flashing a gold badge clipped to his belt. The patrol officers had radioed for a financial crimes detective the exact moment Cameron had spontaneously confessed to wire fraud and real estate forgery. The detective walked over to the lead officer, exchanging a few quiet, urgent words before turning his attention to the chaotic scene unfolding on the lawn. I turned away from my parents and walked directly toward the newly arrived detective. Donovan matched my stride, remaining a silent, intimidating presence at my shoulder. The detective introduced himself as Detective Miller, casting a wary professional glance at Patricia, who was still kneeling on the ground in stunned, absolute silence. "Detective Miller," I said smoothly, extending my hand. "My name is Lydia Wilson. I believe I have some critical information that will greatly expedite your current investigation into Cameron Wilson's real estate fraud." I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, heavily bound manila folder. It was over 2 inches thick, packed with meticulously organized documents, highlighted bank statements, and notarized financial logs. I had spent years quietly and methodically compiling this specific file, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to deploy it. By the way, I said, handing the heavy folder directly to the detective, "I would also like to officially file a comprehensive police report for long-term identity theft and grand financial fraud against my parents, Richard and Patricia Wilson." Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He took a stumbling step backward, his face turning an ashen, sickly white. "The 12 years of certified bank records showing my parents stealing my identity to fund his failed businesses are all in there," I explained, tapping the heavy cover of the folder. "When I was 22 years old, I discovered that Richard and Patricia had illegally opened 6 different high-limit credit cards using my social security number. They forged my signature on the applications. They maxed out every single card to purchase luxury vehicles and fund Cameron's disastrous early cryptocurrency ventures. When the businesses inevitably collapsed, they defaulted on the massive debt and completely destroyed my credit score. I spent my entire 20s living in cheap, dangerous apartments, unable to secure a basic car loan, while I fought tooth and nail to repair the absolute financial ruin they caused." I paused, ensuring my voice carried perfectly to where my parents were standing paralyzed in the sun. They thought they got away with it because the statute of limitations on the original credit card fraud had expired. However, what they do not know is that I recently uncovered their secondary active fraud network. Inside that folder, you will find absolute proof that they are currently using my stolen social security number to maintain hidden offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide their remaining assets from the IRS. You will also find documentation proving they routinely committed tax fraud by attempting to claim my staging business revenue as their own corporate income. Detective Miller opened the thick folder. He flipped through the first few pages, his eyes widening dramatically as he took in the sheer volume and immaculate organization of the hard evidence. He saw the certified bank transfers, the highlighted IP addresses, tracing the fraudulent applications directly back to Richard's home computer, and the official IRS tax transcripts proving the income manipulation. This was not a messy, complicated family dispute that would require months of tedious, difficult investigation. This was a perfectly packaged, undeniable criminal case wrapped up with a neat little bow. The detective snapped the folder shut. He looked at me with a profound mixture of professional respect and absolute astonishment. He nodded once, acknowledging the devastating power of the weapon I had just handed him. Detective Miller turned around and signaled to the 2 uniformed patrol officers. The officers immediately adjusted their tactical stances and began moving purposefully toward my parents. "Richard and Patricia Wilson," the detective called out, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon air with absolute authority. "I need you both to step away from the property and walk toward the cruiser. We are going to the precinct for extensive questioning regarding identity theft, wire fraud, and federal tax evasion. Cameron Wilson, you are coming with us as well." Richard's knees completely buckled. He grabbed the side of the police cruiser to keep himself from collapsing onto the burning pavement. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken, defeated old man who had finally run out of lies to tell. Patricia remained frozen on her knees, staring blankly at the yellow plastic keychain resting on the brick driveway. She did not scream. She did not cry. Her mind had completely short-circuited, unable to process the absolute total destruction of her fabricated life. Cameron began hyperventilating again, blabbering incoherently about how he was just a victim, but the officers ignored his pathetic whining. They efficiently patted him down and guided him toward the back of the squad car. Courtney was already half a block away, walking briskly down the sidewalk, with her garbage bags, not looking back a single time. I did not stay to watch them place my parents in handcuffs. I had seen exactly enough. The years of emotional manipulation, the stolen money, the relentless gaslighting, and the sheer exhausting burden of carrying their toxic weight were finally over. I had outsmarted them, outmaneuvered them, and completely dismantled their fraudulent empire using nothing but truth and meticulous preparation. I turned my back on the flashing police lights and the murmuring crowd of wealthy neighbors. I walked gracefully toward the idling black town car. Donovan opened the heavy rear door for me, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat. The pristine air conditioning washed over me, cool and refreshing against the oppressive Florida heat. Donovan closed the door with a solid, satisfying click, entirely shutting out the noise of my family's final ruin. "To the office, ma'am," the driver asked respectfully, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "No," I replied, leaning back into the plush leather and letting out a long, deep, peaceful breath. "Take me to the airport. I have a first-class flight to Paris to catch." The driver nodded and pulled the sleek vehicle away from the curb. As the car glided smoothly down the manicured street, I did not look back. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the road ahead, completely ready to begin the rest of my life. 1 month later, the warm coastal breeze felt entirely different. I stood on a pristine stretch of undeveloped beachfront property, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves. The air smelled of salt and absolute unfiltered freedom. Paris had been exactly the palate cleanser I needed, a luxurious 2-week escape filled with Michelin-starred dinners and quiet mornings drinking espresso on cobblestone balconies. I had turned my phone off for the entire trip, ignoring the frantic voicemails from unknown numbers and allowing the sheer magnitude of the explosive driveway showdown to settle. When I finally powered my device back on during the flight home, my inbox was flooded with the spectacular aftermath of my family's total destruction. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed. Cameron was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and interstate forgery. The bank had seized every single asset he falsely claimed to own, leaving him absolutely destitute. Courtney did not wait a single second to protect her own interests. She filed for divorce the exact day Cameron posted his heavily restricted bail, ensuring the legal paperwork was served to him at his cheap motel. She had immediately launched a public smear campaign against him on social media, violently distancing herself from his criminal empire and painting herself as the ultimate victim of his narcissistic lies. Richard and Patricia suffered a fate they considered far worse than actual prison. They were currently out on bail, awaiting their own federal trial for identity theft and massive tax evasion. The IRS had descended upon them like a swarm of locusts, freezing their remaining hidden accounts and launching a brutal forensic audit into 12 years of fabricated financial returns. Without access to their stolen funds, they were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the grimy industrial edge of the city. It featured peeling linoleum floors, paper-thin walls, and the constant deafening roar of the nearby interstate. It was located less than 3 miles from the cheap storage facility, holding the pathetic remnants of their fake luxury life. Their former wealthy friends instantly blacklisted them. Their prestigious country club formally revoked their membership and mailed them a public ban notice. They were entirely shunned by the social circle they had sacrificed my future to impress. I did not feel a single drop of pity for any of them. I unrolled the thick architectural blueprints I was holding in my hands, letting the bright morning sunlight illuminate the intricate white lines. For years, I had used my boutique staging business to transform other people's empty houses into stunning, profitable homes. I had hauled heavy couches, dealt with demanding real estate agents, and quietly built my massive corporate network while my family actively tried to bleed me dry. Now I was finally building something permanently and exclusively for myself. A sleek black town car pulled smoothly onto the gravel shoulder of the coastal highway behind me. Donovan stepped out of the vehicle, looking as impeccably sharp as always. The crisp ocean breeze ruffled his dark suit jacket as he walked purposefully across the sandy grass toward my pristine plot of land. He was carrying his signature leather portfolio, but his usual severe professional scowl was replaced by a broad, genuine smile. He stopped beside me and looked out at the rolling blue ocean and the expansive clear horizon. He took a deep breath of the salt air and nodded his absolute approval. The federal prosecutors called my office this morning. Donovan said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing waves. They confirmed that Richard and Patricia have completely surrendered. They are attempting to negotiate a plea deal to avoid maximum sentencing, but the fraud division is pushing for mandatory jail time and total financial restitution. Cameron is facing a minimum of 5 years in a federal facility. Your stolen identity has been completely scrubbed from their accounts, and your credit profile is entirely restored. You are permanently legally severed from their entire disaster. I kept my eyes fixed on the beautiful ocean horizon. That is exactly what I wanted to hear. I replied, my voice perfectly steady and light. Let them negotiate with the federal government. They are no longer my problem. Donovan opened his leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of premium legal documents. He clicked a heavy silver fountain pen and held it out to me. The commercial zoning permits have cleared the city council, Donovan stated, tapping the bottom line of the top page. The environmental impact studies are perfect and the title is absolutely pristine. Harrison's real estate group was so impressed by how ruthlessly you handled that mechanic's lien that they actually referred this commercial broker directly to my office. The $1.3 million from the cash sale of your parents' former estate is sitting safely in the escrow account, ready to be deployed. I took the heavy silver pen from his hand. I looked down at the blueprints showcasing the modern sweeping architecture of the luxury boutique hotel I had spent the last 3 years secretly designing in my head. It featured an open-air lobby, imported glass infinity pools, and cascading private terraces that I would personally curate. I had the capital, I had the industry connections, and I finally had the absolute freedom to execute my ultimate vision. I signed my name on the final commercial lease agreement with bold, decisive strokes. I flipped to the next page and signed the construction authorization, transferring the $1.3 million directly into the development fund. Every single cent of the money my parents had tried to steal from me was now actively breaking ground on my new empire. I handed the pen and the finalized documents back to Donovan. He securely locked them inside his portfolio and offered me a firm, respectful handshake. I turned back to face the vast, beautiful ocean, listening to the powerful crash of the waves against the pristine shore. My family had spent my entire life trying to bury me under the weight of their relentless toxic entitlement. They had demanded my money, my credit, and my absolute submission. But they had severely underestimated my resilience. They thought they were building a luxury life on my back, but they had simply provided the ashes I needed to build my own kingdom. I stood on my own land, entirely independent and perfectly complete. Looking back at the smoldering ashes of my family's fabricated empire, the most profound lesson I learned was about the true nature of loyalty and self-worth. We are heavily conditioned to believe that blood ties form an unbreakable contract, a lifelong debt we owe simply by existing. However, love and respect should never be transactional, and the word family should never serve as a convenient synonym for financial exploitation. My parents and brother equated my value entirely with what they could extract from my bank accounts and my identity. They mistook my calculated silence for weakness and my long-term patience for submission. What they completely failed to understand is that true power does not roar or throw tantrums on a manicured lawn. It meticulously plans. It gathers indisputable evidence. It quietly builds an impenetrable foundation while the toxic people around you look the other way. If you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your success is routinely minimized, your boundaries are aggressively violated, and your resources are drained by the very people supposed to protect you, hear this clearly. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. Walking away is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of necessary self-preservation. The immense energy you waste trying to earn impossible approval is the exact energy you need to build your own empire. True wealth is not a stolen address or a forged corporate deed. It is the absolute unshakable peace of knowing you can stand entirely on your own 2 feet. Share your stories of drawing hard lines and protecting your peace in the comments below. If my journey to absolute independence resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of reclaiming your power. Remember, you always have the absolute right to walk away and build your own kingdom.